We're live.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Betsy Campbell, Executive Vice President of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and also a very proud board member of Hispanics in Philanthropy. I'm honored to be here today to introduce our session, Reimagining Democracy. This session is designed as a conversation between two great leaders in thinking and in action who have worked tirelessly to advance democratic principles and to strengthen the institutions on which our democracy is grounded. It is my great pleasure to introduce them to you now. Stephen Heintz is president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Stephen has devoted his career to strengthening democratic culture and institutions to better serve citizens in the United States and internationally. In 2000, he co-founded and served as the first president of DEMOS, a public policy organization that works to reduce political and economic inequality and to broaden citizen engagement. In 2018, Stephen was named by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences as one of 3 co-chairs of a national commission on the practice of democratic citizenship in the 21st century. Antonia Hernandez is president and CEO of the California Community Foundation. She is nationally regarded for her expertise in civil rights, immigration, and philanthropy. Antonia has spent more than 4 decades advocating for social justice and improving the lives of the underserved in communities in Los Angeles County and well beyond. She also serves as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission. Thanks so much to you both, Antonia and Stephen, for being here with us today. In this session, we envisioned that the two of you would hold a conversation on how we need to rebuild and reimagine ways to move our democracy forward by engaging communities and by making American democracy more inclusive and vibrant. With all that's going on right now in this moment of crisis, we cannot wait. We need to move with urgency to forge a collective path and guide our democracy to be stronger, more responsive, and more equitable. Antonia and Stephen, I'd like to start by asking you both to say, why did you say yes to joining this commission? What's the commission? Why is its work important today? Antonia, let me start with you.
Well, as you've indicated, I've spent 4 decades working on behalf of vulnerable communities. And to me, America is an ideal with great ideals, many of which we have not lived up to. And at the particular moment today, it is evident that our democracy needs reimagining. We need to excite individuals to feel that they're part of this democracy, that they have rights, but that we also have a collective responsibility to this democracy. And I was eager to really think about how can we make it better? How can we improve it? How can we bring it current to the 21st century? How can we, as a more inclusive, diverse community, re-energize and reimagine our democracy? So that's why, to me, it was an exciting proposition.
Stephen, can you say a bit more about the commission itself, its own history and place in American society, and why you joined, what your aspirations have been?
Sure, thanks. And thank you all for joining us. Antonia and I have been looking forward to this discussion with all of you, and we really appreciate the interest in this work. So the American Academy of Arts and Sciences is an institution that was founded in 1780 by a number of the founders of our country who wanted to create a society where leading citizens from all sectors of America would come together in service of the young nation to help it survive. And it has members elected by the Academy itself, coming from science, the arts, the Academy, activists, politicians, artists. So it's very broad, very, very diverse. And they came to the conclusion a few years ago that American democracy was in crisis, a conclusion that I know Antonia and I very much agree with. and that this particular academy, founded in 1780 as part of the beginning of our nation, to serve the nation in moments of need, was well positioned to try to do something about it. So they decided to organize a national commission, and the commission is 35 individuals. It's quite diverse in every respect, every corner of the country. Men, women, racially diverse, ideologically diverse. We have a number of real progressive leaders, but we also have some very, very thoughtful conservative leaders. And I joined the commission, like Antonia, because my career has really been about trying to make democracy work on behalf of people. Starting out in politics myself and government service in the first phase of my career. And at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, we have a program emphasis on strengthening the quality of democracy in the United States. So it was inspiring for me personally, and it fit very closely institutionally. And it has been, as Antonia said, both an inspiring and an exciting and challenging project. And I have to say, it's been a great pleasure working with Antonia as part of this.
I think it would be great to hear a little bit about the process that has led to a report, which will be issued very soon, and we'll get to the recommendations shortly. But I think the process itself is an important part of the commission. Antonia, would you want to say a word or two about that?
Well, that was one of the most interesting parts. It was sort of democracy within democracy. And first of all, 3 co-chairs, which was interesting. And, you know, the commission functioned for over 2 years. In watching these 3 individuals, including Stephen, who was one of the co-chairs, was an interesting exercise in itself. But to me, the most interesting part is that this commission went to the community, held over 52 separate meetings throughout the country, from refugees, you know, to the elite, to politicians, to the business community. It went into communities. I myself hosted 3 meetings in Los Angeles to bring communities to talk to the academy, so that the academy members could listen and hear from the diverse communities. I brought in activists from the Los Angeles community, organizers from the community, diversity, you know, as far as, you know, LA is one of the most diverse places in the world, to bring all those people together, to give them a sense of how they view democracy. What they viewed were the positives, and what they viewed were the challenges, whether it was in voting, you know, the rights of immigrants, the role of immigrants that are not citizens in our society. They are citizens. They're just not legally voting citizens. How do you engage them? How do you make them feel part of the community? So to me, that was the exciting part. And so, you know, going into the Midwest, you know, our country is one of ideals. We're not united by, you know, by the way we look, by what we think. What unites us is an ideal. And so we wanted to know, how does an immigrant from Vietnam think of the ideal of America? You know, how does a native from, you know, South Dakota, you know, feel about America? So to me, it was getting this input, and that's why I have a great deal of faith, and I'm so excited about this report, because it truly captures the mood of the country as it is today and the aspirations for its future.
Great. Well, before we move to be tantalized by some of the emerging recommendations, Stephen, is there anything you wanted to add?
Just one thought. Antonia has, I think, pointed out the most important part, which was that we really listened to people. We have thousands of pages of transcripts of these sessions, and the recommendations in many ways emerged from those conversations. And the other point that I would add is that because we had an ideologically diverse commission, you know, it was challenging to achieve consensus on a package of 33 separate recommendations. Mm-hmm. As we were studying history, we came across a wonderful quotation from Benjamin Franklin, mm-hmm. who at the end of the Constitutional Convention stood up and said basically, and I'm paraphrasing and will not be as eloquent, but he stood up and said, I will vote for this Constitution, not because I think it is perfect, not because I agree with every one of its articles, but because I think it is the best that we can achieve in this time. And I will sacrifice my own opinions of some of its flaws for the larger common good. And we kept that quotation in mind as we debated in the commission, the recommendations that you will soon see. And it really helped, because not everybody agrees with every recommendation, but everybody agrees with the necessity to reinvent American democracy, and that the total of these recommendations present a really comprehensive plan that deserves a lot of public discussion and debate and action.
And you know what, the other quote, and it was one of the founders, I can't remember whom, as he was walking out after the debate, a woman was passing down and asked him, what did you give us? And he says, Madame, I gave you a democracy if you can keep it. And that's the question. Can we keep and reimagine this democracy to serve us? Because we are still the oldest democracy, functioning democracy in the world.
So Antonia, could you speak to one or two of the recommendations that you're particularly excited about?
Well, you know, as a civil rights lawyer, I tend to, of course, look at the world through the lens of my life experience. And as the former president and general counsel of MALDEF, being involved in the courts has been a major part of my life. So looking at the faults, at the weakness of the court system, particularly the federal court system, is something that's very interesting to me. You know, the ability, we have three, you know, parts of government, the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative, and of equal powers, but yet, you know, interdependent. And one of the things that I was, you know, have been gravely concerned about throughout history is the stacking and the packing of the courts through certain ideological points of view, as is today. That's what we have. So to me, the two big concerns was the ability of presidents to pack the Supreme Court and the other federal courts. So there are some major recommendations about the ability of presidents to pack the courts. The second one is the ability of, once, you know, confirmed to the Supreme Court, to be there for life. And so tenure is also a very important aspect. So to me was the churning of the court, the ability to have levers that gave us a sense of more even-handedness in the selection and the appointment. You know, when I worked in the Judiciary Committee, I, you know, worked on the confirmation of many Court of Appeals judges. This was in 78, 79. And so I saw the strengths and the weakness from within of the selection. And then, of course, the big issue is that the federal courts, particularly the federal courts, are not representative of the diversity of the community. And you have to have people that look like you sitting there judging you in order to feel that you're being judged by your peers. So to me, that's something that I really focused on. And I believe that the public is going to be really surprised and, I would say, shocked at the fact that this commission, the chutzpah to touch some sacred cows, and that's what we're doing. So I'm very excited about that. And there's so many other in the 33 recommendations that we made, but the judiciary was a special interest of mine.
That's amazing. That's just amazing. Stephen.
Yeah, well, this is a difficult question. It's like being asked, you know, which of your children do you love the most? A couple of things that I'll say, and then I'll pick out a couple to highlight. One thing that I think is distinctive about this work is that we looked at the institutions and processes of our democracy, and we have a number of recommendations like the one that Antonia just was talking about those institutions and processes, voting, the Congress, et cetera, money in politics, you know. But we also looked at the important role of civil society, all of you in this audience, in the organizations that you represent, and how critically important civil society is to the vibrancy and the health of our democratic life. And then the third was political culture. And we know that this is a particularly acute problem at the moment because of the radically disrupted media and information environment. And our political culture is fraying. And so we have recommendations in all three areas. So a couple of teasers here. One, we also have not stepped back from constitutional issues. So we have recommended a constitutional amendment to deal with the money in politics problem. We examined how our representative democracy over time has become much less representative and less democratic. And so we have a recommendation about expanding the size of the House of Representatives to make it a more representative body again. And this would also expand the size of the Electoral College to create a more balanced structure to the Electoral College. And in the civil society space, we listen to all of these stories of people doing remarkably innovative and impressive and impactful work in community with very, very scarce resources and without a kind of civic infrastructure across the nation to support that vital work. So one of the inventions that the Commission came up with is a recommendation to create a national trust for civic infrastructure, which would be a vehicle through which philanthropic and hopefully government funding would flow to communities to support civic infrastructure for people to work together to solve community problems. So those are just a few highlights, and I hope all of you will sign up for the launch event on June 11th, and also to see the report when it comes out on that day.
Great, thank you, Stephen. So as you say, the report will be launched on June 11th. I think there is an invitation actually somehow in this magical app that the HIP staff have put together. So if you don't find it, we'll figure out some way to make sure that you do. Antonia, can you tell us what happens after the big launch on the 11th and this is all then public? What happens next?
Well, I think that for the Commission and for the Academy, this is the challenge because we're going into uncharted territory, and the Academy itself is going to uncharted territory. We don't want it to be just a report that's put on read and a couple of editorials come out and then it's put on a shelf. The responsibility of the Commission and the Academy, and they're putting together a plan to really go out to community. One of the things that was done in February was to re-invite every person who attended one of the 52 meetings to Boston to come together to hear the recommendations and to react to those recommendations, because we want ambassadors in every community. The challenge is going to be developing a plan of implementation. And this is where HIP comes in. You all have vast networks. You're not going to love every single recommendations, but I can assure you that you're going to like the majority of the recommendations. And it's going to be the participation and involvement of the public, of organizations that you lead and you fund to really give wheels to these changes. These are gutsy recommendations. It's going to take political will, and that political will only come if the populace, the people of this country, push for those changes. They're not going to be automatic. So I think to a large degree, the Academy will move forward and will become more active. The members of the Commission will be out there speaking as we are with you today. But at the end of the day, it's going to be you and us together pushing for these changes. And at the end of the day, these changes make so much sense. We all know it. We know the solutions that need to be taken. What we lack is the collective will to make those changes.
Thank you. We would be happy to take some questions for Antonia and Stephen, but just by way of beginning to wrap up at least this part of the discussion, Stephen, let me ask you, what makes you optimistic that these bold recommendations can be taken up and can really start to provide a path to deep change?
It's an even harder question to answer today than it might have been 2 weeks ago, given the events that we are all witness to. But that is, in fact, what gives me optimism about this. There is a growing recognition in this country that things have gone wrong, that they've been wrong in some respects since 1619, when first enslaved Africans were brought to our shores, and that there is no time to waste in creating a more equitable and inclusive democracy. So I feel like there's a receptivity out there. I think there's, even before the pandemic and before the murder of George Floyd, there was a sense that our democracy was failing us in many, many ways. And they have only been heightened by the pandemic and by the racial justice crisis. And so that does give me hope. I think that there is an appetite for this. As Antonia was describing those citizen meetings that we held, there was a huge hunger expressed by Americans for a sense that the democracy was going to work for them and that they could really participate in it and shape the future of this country. So that's what gives me hope. And the Academy, as Antonia has said, is committed to working on this through the 250th anniversary of our founding, which is in 2026. And so we're going to be helping to build coalitions, to reach out to people, to energize activism and organizing and advocacy and pushing and pushing and pushing. And that's how progress is going to get made.
Antonia, you mentioned the role of HIP and its membership in this, which I think is a really important point to raise. Is there anything drawing on your role in philanthropy that you would also add about the role of funders, foundations across the country in this?
I'm very optimistic about the role of philanthropy, and I think philanthropy also has to sort of stretch itself. We have to fund the organizations that are organizing the community. We have to fund advocacy. We have to fund the mechanisms and the tools. We have to look at the systemic problems, where they are, and go at the roots of the systemic problems. And that's the role of philanthropy. You know, when I came into philanthropy, I thought to myself, what is a troublemaking civil rights lawyer doing in philanthropy? The fact of the matter is that I was the right person because I've been on the streets. I've been working to change society, and I had a sense of how change happens. So I think the philanthropy and all of the members of HIP and all the members of philanthropy, let's be a little less risk adverse. Let's fund the institutions that are going to be our partners in making change happen. And sometimes it's not pleasant. Sometimes it's not comfortable. You know, let's look at our grantees as partners. They have the solutions. They're the ones out on the street. They're the ones that are connecting with community. Philanthropy is just an enabler. Well, we have to be better partners, and we have to have a relationship where we, you know, sort of share the problems. It's not always nice. So I would say that philanthropy needs a little kick in the tushy and be less risk adverse and get out there and work in the community.
Stephen, any other words on that?
Amen to all of that. And I do think, you know, more for the national foundations than the community foundations, but maybe for both. But in any case, since I'm part of a national foundation, I know that community better. There is a hesitation to get involved in this kind of work because it's seen as political. It's not political in a partisan sense, and the commission actually proves that point. It is essential that philanthropy get involved in this, and American foundations in total, on an annual basis, are giving only 2% of their annual grants budgets to work to strengthen our democracy. And yet everything else foundations care about depends on the democracy really functioning. And so I think it's time for philanthropy to step up and to work together. And I'm really excited about how national foundations and community foundations can work together to advance this work. And we need all of you. We really need all of you. And we want your ideas. We want your energy. We want your creativity. So please join with us.
So this topic of taking risks and stepping out and stepping up as philanthropy is really important. Could either of you or both of you offer examples of a foundation or foundation experience that you're aware of where a foundation really has taken some risks?
Well, I would say, that California is, and I'm not just, CCF, but California sort of collectively philanthropy has been stepping out and funding, and I want to reinforce what Stephen said. I see CCF as political, not partisan, but political in the sense that we're about change. We're about working to improve the lives of the most vulnerable. That's political. It's not partisan. And in order to be effective politically, you have to work with the levers of change. You have to partner with the public sector, with the legislators, with the people who are making the rules. You have to also enable them. And so you have to understand the bureaucracy that they're working within and the people. To me, it's, as an example, in California, we have an initiative which is called Communities in Schools. CCF does not, nilly-willy endorse everything that comes up, but we're endorsing this. And we're funding the organizations that are going to get the votes out. 2 years ago, there was a tax increase proposal and a bond increase in LA County for the issue of the homelessness. From philanthropy, we funded that effort. It was political, but it was nonpartisan. And I think that philanthropy has to understand and feel more comfortable, because if we're not engaging in funding the organizations and being part of the movement to change, then we're just spreading it like butter. It's a comfort level. It's not real change. So, and I will tell you, when I first came to CCF, when I first proposed, and I'll give you a little story, because it's so indicative. There was 204, and in 205, the federal government had sent a letter to the city of LA that it was cutting off $100 million in grants to work to deal with the homeless issue because they hadn't done the regulatory bureaucracy thing. So a group came to me and saying, we need $50,000 to go to Washington and to change, and to convince the folks and to work with the city to get that problem solved. So I went to the board at that time and I said, I need $50,000 for this. And I didn't talk about, political and change. I talked about leverage. I said $50,000 will leverage, and there's no way that the state can duplicate the funding of $100 million. They approved it. After they came back at the next board meeting, I said, that's systemic change. That's engaging. That's really leveraging $50,000 for $100 million. So you have to not put it in political terms. You have to put it in terms about our leveraging our dollars to solve a problem. And then I said, that's political. That's advocacy. That's public policy. And we drafted a policy, and since then we've been involved. So I think it also takes smarts on our part. This is not about using words of division. This is not about, whatever. This is about finding a way to fund solutions. And that to me, that's what I was hired to do.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that example and inspiration to all of us in philanthropy to really step up and to look for strategic ways to support the kinds of things that the Commission is going to be recommending, and we're also hearing from the people right now in the streets demanding. Thank you so much to both of you for your leadership, and congratulations on the work of the Academy and the Commission, and good luck with your launch next week. I hope many of the HIP audience will join you and will be part of the coalitions needed to bring it all forward. Thanks so very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you very much.